So today we're taking a closer look at the political landscape here at home as far as it relates to just how we've communicated the issues around the coronavirus. And Professor Steven Friedman joins us now on the line to give us a sense of what role medical science and epidemiology play in deciding when and how to ease lockdown regulations and perhaps the politics around those issues. Professor, thanks very much for your time on the AM report. I mean, there's a lot of, it appears, a lot of double speak and politicking, one might say, especially regarding the lockdown, when to ease restrictions and so on. What's your reading of government's handling?
Yeah, Michelle, it's very confused at the moment in many ways. Look, part of the problem is that in contrast to the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 10, 15 years ago, the government is relying very heavily on medical scientists. The problem is that there isn't that much that medical scientists have to contribute. The reason being that if you go back to AIDS, there was a whole, people romanticize it to a certain extent. We should have relied on the science, etc. The science on AIDS was very, very clear cut. There was a medication which you could take, which meant that you didn't die from the disease, which meant that you could live a normal life. And the dispute was about the fact that the government, for various reasons, didn't want to pay for that medication. So following the science then meant making sure that people got their medication. Unfortunately, with COVID-19, there is no medication. It's also a very new disease. The scientists, when you press them on it, admit very clearly that there's not that much that they know about it. And therefore, in a sense, we're being told that things are being decided by the science when the science itself is not very clear and not very helpful. And obviously this leads to a great deal of confusion, it leads to a great deal of tension. On the other hand, there is also, it must be said, a great deal of infighting among the scientists, which has to do with egos. It has to do with claims that proper procedure wasn't followed in the appointment of the Medical Advisory Council, and that is obviously making it even more unclear, because basically in the argument about whether we should reduce the lockdown, everybody picks the medical scientist as their choice and says, you see, medical science is on my side, and what they don't tell you is that the medical scientist down the corridor has a different view.
And then we see, things like just yesterday we spoke to Professor Glenda Gray, who's part of that Ministerial Advisory Council, perhaps in some sense breaking rank and speaking out against the continued lockdown, the regulations around whether you might buy, you're able to buy open-toed shoes versus boots for winter and so on. She's questioning just the rationality of the lockdown. And I get the sense just from the coverage we're seeing in the papers this morning, there's not a lot of happiness around that there.
Well, first of all, it must be said that, it's not really that she's breaking ranks. Shadia Mahdi, has been saying the same thing for a while. I think the question we should ask as South Africans is Dr. Gray basing this on the latest medical science, or is she basing it on a gut opinion like everybody else? And I'm afraid the more I look at it, which on either side, we're dealing here with gut opinions. And I think the problem is, unfortunately, that scientists, like all human beings, have egos. They like the limelight. They like lots of people asking their opinions. And they're not always forthcoming about the fact that their opinions are just opinions. I must say that if you want state-of-the-art science on COVID-19, from my experience, the best place to look, if you or any of your viewers get the chance, is at the regular briefings of the World Health Organization and their team of scientists. And what stands out about the World Health Organization's team of scientists is that they never claim to know things which they don't know.
Yeah.
They're always very honest about the fact that, look, we're learning about this, there are different opinions, these are different opinions, but make up your own mind. And I think we need far more of this here.
Look, Prof, to be fair on government here at home, and Minister Zweli Mkhize, in fact, has said the same thing that you've just said about the World Health Organization. The minister has said, you know, this is a new phenomenon. We are finding out more about it as we go along. No one is an expert on COVID-19. At the moment, government is relying on best practice in the rest of the world, where some of those practices have succeeded and where they failed.
Yes, and I must say, you know, we generalize it as government to a certain extent. If I have to actually single out people, the Minister of Health is usually exemplary about this. He's very cautious, if you listen to him carefully, as you've correctly said, of saying, look, this is what we think. You know, when the Minister of Trade and Industry, Brian Patel, was announcing to the world that the Demand Council had the power to tell the virus to only come in September, which was absurd, it was Dr. Mkhize who said, no, look, really, what we mean is we think the lockdown has bumped us out to perhaps August and September. And then you have a far more realistic sense of what's going on. I think what is happening to a certain extent here is that, as the Minister has said, the government is being led to a large degree by the thinking in the World Health Organization. And as I said earlier, the World Health Organization is not basing this on rocket science. Yeah. They're a UN organization. They're in contact with every government on the planet. They have a pretty good idea of what's working at the moment and what isn't working at the moment. And that does seem to be the most sensible science to base an opinion on, because all we have to go on is the experience around the world as people buy things and see if they work or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just talk to you about the politicking that we've seen around the lockdown regulations in particular, and just the communication that we've gotten from government. So first of all, government is telling us we must do, as individuals, we must do everything we can to protect ourselves from this virus. Secondly, government tells us we will most likely fail. Whatever we do, there is going to be a surge. There's going to be a massive loss of life. Do you get a sense that government, at least in this particular kind of messaging, is really just trying to cover its bases?
Well, it has that effect, Michelle, and it must be said again that government may well have said this anyway, because, as I pointed out before, I mean, it's a pretty obvious thing for government to say in this situation, because, as your question implies, it means that you can never be blamed. Because if we do have a huge outbreak, then government can say, well, we told you this all along. But in fact, the scientists have been saying this as well, or our scientists, not the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization is very clear on what the reality is. And the reality, which we are not being told sufficiently in this country, that there are quite a few countries around the world who have prevented a severe epidemic, who's prevented a surge. There was no huge loss of life in South Korea, or in the Indian states of Kerala, or in Vietnam, or in many other places I could mention. And I think once again we are being let down as South Africans. What they may be saying is that they don't think that they can control the surge. And that's a very different issue to say that it's inevitable. So basically what we are presented with is something which gets all the politicians get off scot-free when we should be holding them to account.
Professor Steven Friedman, thanks very much for your time this morning on the AM report, just giving us some analysis there on some of the salient issues around COVID-19. I think South Korea in particular, perhaps as I just wrap up the segment of the show, is an important case study, just because it was quite a good case study of just how it was able to manage. It's a success story of how it's been able to manage the virus until it opened up bars and it saw more infections, sort of a second wave of infections in South Korea. That's something to keep in mind.